Hi, and welcome to Not Your Sassy Gay Friend, How to Write LGBTQ Characters Beyond Tropes and Stereotypes. I'm Alex Harrow, and I write queerness with a chance of explosions. Quick thing about me, I'm a queer speculative fiction author. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. And my adult debut, which is queer speculative fiction, Empire of Light, released on February 25th, 2019 with 9 Star Press. If you have any questions about this presentation or would like access to my slides, feel free to contact me at alex@alexharrow.com or check out my social media, specifically Twitter and Instagram at alexharrowsff. Welcome. All right, yes, this is basically going to be a rant with a ton of GIFs, so here's your warning. And yes, this is also your license to ask me personally anything after this presentation, or feel free to reach out to me on via chat or social media. I promise I can handle it. I'm a high school teacher, but I'm not an author writing sweary queer content. So just putting that out there. I also want to put out there that I'm obviously just one person. And I'm going to talk about my labels here in a minute. But so please don't take my advice as the only advice there is about writing queer characters, because that's not how this works, and that's not ever what I aim to do. There are a lot of different lenses we see things through, so as always, take what advice works for you, check other things, do your research. All right, a couple of things that I want to talk about, because queerness isn't a monolith. Like, I can't really comment on the experience of all types of queer people, because that is not how lived experience works. So your mileage may vary in this, but I do want to briefly go over some labels and terms I identify with in terms of sexuality, which is sexuality and romance preferences, and labels I use to identify in terms of gender, which are not the same thing. And this is kind of like where we're starting, is please don't conflate these two things. They're very different, and again, very different and individual to the specific person. I myself identify both as bisexual and pansexual, but honestly usually use the term queer as an umbrella term, because that way I don't have to get into the definition of like, hey, how is bisexuality different than pansexual, or are they really the same? Really, for me, it just means like I don't really care about gender when it comes to attraction and sexuality. I also am demisexual, which means in order to be sexually attracted to someone, I need to have a deeper bond with them first. I need to get to know them. Things like blind dates sound awful to me. No, I'm not interested in like whatever hot actor you find hot, because I haven't talked to them about like their favorite books yet. So that doesn't really work for me. But again, that's how I identify with this label and define this label. Others may do so differently. Demi-romantic is much in the same vein. I've actually started to embrace my own aromanticism, meaning I'm not really romantically interested in anyone. And if I am, again, I have to really, really know them. And it really depends on this person. Basically, if you want to put it in a nutshell, traditional relationships don't work for me. I also personally identify as polyamorous, which means I tend to date more than one person. Depending on the time. Sometimes it's just one, sometimes it's more than one. Polyamory, again, is a huge, huge umbrella term, and there's so many subsets. But again, this is a label and a community I strongly identify with, and that's why it's on this list. Labels in terms of gender, and again, this changes a lot. I personally have been socialized or raised as a specific label that I no longer identify with. I personally am a non-binary trans man. That's usually how I describe myself to others, which means, yes, I identify as a transgender man, but I also am definitely identifying as a non-binary person, meaning it's not that clear cut. Like, I do not believe in binary gender roles, and I do not see my own gender as that binary anywhere on that binary system. Transmasculine is a similar label to this, basically saying, hey, I am a trans person who is on the more masculine side of the spectrum. But again, this varies. My pronouns are he, him, or they, them. And again, a lot of these things are subject to change. For me personally, he, him pronouns are kind of like a new thing that I've been embracing, where I kind of had my own gender euphoria and awakening of like realizing, oh, like this is really what fits. So again, to tie back to queerness isn't a monolith, it also means labels and things and identities change, and that's okay. Really, if you don't take out anything else from this presentation, it's that it's okay to question things and to try out different things. Please don't subscribe to just like one narrative of queerness and identity and sexuality and gender. It doesn't work that way. It's much more wibbly wobbly, as Doctor Who would say. So let's start with some don'ts when it comes to queer representation. And yes, we're going to talk about some problematic stuff. And again, there might be some content that you've seen before, maybe even some characters that you like and that fall into these problematic stereotypes. Again, this doesn't mean that you can't have, you can't enjoy these people or these characterizations, but it's definitely something that we as a society have moved beyond. So one of the reasons that I'm going over stereotypes here is that often when it comes to portraying people in a way that's not harmful and stereotypical, people often fall back to not knowing what some of these stereotypes are and why they're harmful. So I want to go over that first and then get into some things that we all want to see more of. And by we all, I mean, I'm kind of speaking for the wider queer community, at least people in my personal circle. So again, take it with a grain of salt, but also I would encourage you to pay attention to some of these tropes around you. All right. So this presentation is called Not Your Sassy Gay Friend because, frankly, that's all we were allowed to be for so many years. One of the problems with the stereotype, and again, we love these characters, but because that's all we were given for years and even decades throughout this. One recommendation that I have for you, and I'm leaving you all with some movie and book recommendations, but there's a documentary on Netflix called Disclosure. It specifically focuses on trans representation in the media, but the intersection between queerness and transness is definitely there. I would very, very much encourage you to check out this documentary. Some of it is really hard to watch because it deals with a lot of transphobia in the media, but ultimately it also shows just how far we've come and how much further we have to go and how we're on a good track so far, but also how it's important to always push for more. But yeah, the sassy gay friend, as much as we all might love them, the problem is if your gay characters only ever get to be the sidekicks, the comic relief, the person who never gets center stage in anything, who never gets their happy ending. It's just an incredibly reductive reading of queerness. And that doesn't mean that there can't be sassy gay friends in your novels or in your stories, but don't have them be the only person that's there. What about the sassy straight friend? Who is your sassy gay friend also friends with? Maybe, like they're not just the side character in here. So, again, all of these are kind of tropes for a reason because they've been characterized like this throughout so many years of media. But this is to say we can do more than that. Let's give our queers some center stage. Along with this goes the comic relief. If you've seen The Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, you know Titus. Like, he's essentially comic relief. He's essentially the sassy gay friend. A lot of these tropes kind of overlap. And again, it feels really unsatisfying if that person isn't given a fully realized character arc. I think one of the things that make Titus specifically work in this setting is that he gets to be more than just the comic relief and just the sassy gay friend. Like, these are tropes we're starting out with, but we're adding to this and we are building this more. But again, be aware of some of the problematic tropes that are coming along with that. I just today was in a Twitter discussion about a recent SNL episode where they did that skit where the male moderator was kissing another male person, and they just did it for laughs and ha ha. It's so funny when another guy kisses another guy. It's so incredibly harmful that this is what queerness and gayness gets relegated to. We all have spent decades as the butt of jokes, if that. So we need to get beyond that. Okay, like, use these as things to build on and build beyond, subvert any of these tropes. Like, tropes are tropes for a reason, and what matters isn't that we like cancel certain tropes and elevate others, but what matters is what we do with all of that, and being aware of the problematic nature or the reductive nature of some of these tropes help us go beyond that. My personal favorite, the bury your gays trope, which, if you've seen the 100, you know what I'm talking about. No spoilers, but if you've seen Game of Thrones, I mean, okay, everyone dies in Game of Thrones, so I get that argument, but also, like, not one queer character ever gets anything akin to a happy ending in the books or the show. And that's a problem. It like tells your queer audience or even your questioning audience that that's basically all we've got coming for us, and that we're easily expendable, or worse, are cannon fodder for the growth of the straight, white, able-bodied character. Consider what you're saying if you kill a character off and, oh, by the way, they were also in love with the main character and totally secretly queer and never got the happy ending. Like, what are you saying to all of your readers that identify as queer? And honestly, again, we're over this. This is a trope that needs to go. There shouldn't just be your token gay person. Okay? Like, and then they shouldn't just die, because there's just so many implications throughout history where, like, that's all the kind of stage queer people would ever get, and that's no longer with the times, and it's incredibly disrespectful. This is one that a lot of publishers, specifically LGBTQ publishers, will list as their, hey, we're not looking for this kind of content list. This is the gay for you trope. The whole, like, oh, like, I'm not gay, I just like you. Or, oh, this person turned this other person gay. Or, oh, I'm just doing this to, like, impress this person or to make this person jealous. Like, whatever kind of reduces queerness to a gimmick, to a party trick, to an unhealthy piece in a relationship, just don't do it. It doesn't work. There's so many more facets to this, that, again, this is incredibly reductive and harmful and invalidates queer existence and queer life all over the place. So just don't do it. Hard pass on that. Gay villains, again, doesn't mean you can't have gay villains, but also have, like, gay protagonists. Have a varied cast. And yes, by the way, Jafar often gets coded as a gay villain, so he's definitely on that list. There are some others that I'm going to get into later, but basically this whole idea of, like, oh, like, the villain is a villain because they're gay and they're misunderstood, or, oh, they're villainous and they're also gay because gays are villains. Like, there are just so many problematic takes people can have with this. Again, like, if you have a queer villain, are they the only queer person in your cast? Then you have a problem. If they're not, and their queerness just kind of adds to them as a fully rounded character, that's potential you can play with. But again, like, keep that in mind. Again, this is not a monolith. Identities intersect, and whether you're intentionally or unintentionally making certain comments with how people read your characters, that's something you want to keep in mind, because those are things that you can control and do your best to vary your representation as much as possible. Queer predators. We've all seen, or a lot of us have seen or read Silence of the Lambs, where, again, queerness often, like especially here also, transness gets vilified and gets coded as, oh, but they're predators and something's fundamentally wrong with them. They're mentally ill. And again, this is not to say that mental illness and queerness aren't two important facets to put together in some characters. But again, what comment are you making if your only queer character is also a psychopath, is also a serial murderer, is also a cannibal, is whatever other problematic label you will give them? Because again, this is like the only way so many queer people have ever been able to see themselves, and it casts just such a shadow over that kind of portrayal. It gets even worse, honestly, if we're looking at if this person is a queer person who's also quoted as a predator and is a person of color. Like, it gets even worse than that. There's so many elements of racism, homophobia, transphobia that are coded into these tropes that I would just really encourage you to stay away from that, to like be aware how much damage these tropes can do, and to elevate your writing and your characters beyond that. Gay panic, which we've seen as a legitimate defense in cases like, oh, this person because he was afraid of queer people, or oh, there are too many queer people in this space. Like, these are things, again, our society should be past, but in some facets isn't past yet. The things that people feel like, oh, it's something that's justifiable if a character punches another because they feel like he's coming onto them, or he like legitimately is like afraid of gay people, or yeah, just don't do this. As Jonathan Van Ness would say, like, no, don't. This is, again, a trope that needs to go. Queerbaiting, which we see in still way too many shows, and yes, Sherlock is one of my favorite examples for this. It's queerbaiting, if you don't know what that is when characters are presented in a way that they could very conceivably be gay or queer, but it is never explicitly said in the show. It's a very cheap way of baiting, that's the term, a queer audience, seeing, like, teasing them with ways to possibly see them represented, but then a writer or studio's unwillingness to actually make them gay or queer on screen, on the page. This is why so many queer people push for on the page representation, like using some of these labels that I mentioned earlier, actually seeing them in print and seeing people honestly talk about what these things mean to them in nuanced ways, in bold and new ways, makes such a big difference. And just saying, oh, this character, by the way, is gay, but we're not really ever seeing this on screen. Netflix's Voltron did this kind of, like, they mixed queer baiting with the bury your gays trope when one of the main characters was coded as a gay or bisexual person who had a boyfriend, but then his boyfriend died within like 2 seconds of screen time. Like, that's queer baiting because it got fans super excited when this info was dropped during Comic-Con, and then all you get is a second and, oh yeah, this person's also dead, and they're not like happy in the end. Like, it's it's just a double slap in the face. And again, it feels like people are using queer communities to make money off of, to profit from, but do not actually honor us and our existence. So again, if you're including queer characters, make them queer, make them explicitly queer. That's what we're here to see. Also, the show tunes gay. So queer people are a monolith. Like, just because we have a gay man who is a character in a movie, TV show, a book, doesn't mean that they're the show tunes or leading ladies kind of gay. They don't have to have immaculate nails and the perfect eyebrows and be really obsessed in clothing. Like, your gay character can be an assassin. Your gay character can be someone who has like your just average life, who doesn't in any way, shape, or form present as a man who's effeminate or a man who has only like very specific interests. Again, like, this kind of diminishes all of the identities that factor into this. Make your characters complete and rounded out characters. Make this person like someone who maybe is functioning in a very like male dominated job and he's very happily out and also knows show tunes. Like, go for that. In some ways, Brooklyn Nine-Nine did really well with this, and others not so much. But consider just some of the stereotypes that exist, and again, how you can shake this up and loosen these things up a little bit. And then I already mentioned this, but if you only have the token gay of the bunch, like, Glee is a notable exception, though they had kind of the same issue with lesbian or bi-coded characters, where there's only one, and then of course this one character usually also suffers because of their queerness, because along with tokenization also often comes like a certain fetishization of queerness and queer pain. That's problematic. And honestly, this is probably one of the questions that get asked the most, is, so how do I avoid tokenizing a character? How do I avoid token characters? And honestly, the answer to this is really easy, is don't just have one. Queer characters have tons of queer friends. They're usually never the one single token gay, especially in our current age of social media, especially if, like, let's say this person lives in extremely rural Utah. Like, they probably still have internet access. They probably still have connections beyond that. And yeah, they're probably like, they're definitely not going to be the only person there. So again, like, shake that up. Like, give them queer friends, give them trans friends, give them bisexual friends, give them people from all over the place. And that's going to like take care of your tokenization right there. Is, don't just have one. Make your entire cast super diverse, and don't do it for diversity points. Like, this is not a point system. And also the socially acceptable gay. Like, hey, what's okay to do and what's not okay to do? Again, this is kind of where we're tapping into areas that kind of have these tropes overlap. Like, very often the socially acceptable gay is your sassy gay friend because, oh, they give your main character fashion advice, and, you know, like, they're comic relief, and they're not really actually very physically gay ever. It's kind of like this whole idea of like, you are whitewashed or straight washed to a sense of, oh, what's palatable to a straight audience? What's palatable to a white or able-bodied or majority paradigm audience? Okay, like, again, like, if we're never letting these characters take risks, being bold, being as diverse and daring as they can be, there's going to be a problem. And that also means like tapping into some of the problematic issues that go along with it. Like, one issue is like, oh, how do queer communities intersect? Like, what is some language that a straight person, for example, maybe shouldn't use the term queer because they don't identify as such? There are a lot of like issues that the queer community is facing that others who are not part of that community don't really get to talk about. But that also means like we can give that a stage in our writing and use that in our writing. So I would again like just advise you to do as much research and read as many different queer writers as possible to gain that knowledge base and be more nuanced in your characterization. Okay, and then finally, and I already mentioned this one, but queer pain. This whole idea that especially, and this gets especially tricky when this is a straight author or a straight writer profiting off of queer pain. Like if let's say a current straight author is writing a book about the AIDS crisis in the 80s and is writing about what it's like to be a gay person of color dealing with AIDS in the 80s. Like that feels like they're profiting from queer pain, and they often like just focus on that as like the narrative, and it kind of again equates it reduces queerness to queer pain, to that sort of dramatization and fetishization, the fact that it's like, oh, this queer person isn't ever going to get a happy ending because of their queer nature. This doesn't mean you can't write queer pain, but again, check yourself. What is your reason for including this? Where are you coming from? These are solid questions to ask. Any of you have seen Love, Simon or read Simon versus the Homo sapiens agenda know that forced outing is unfortunately still a trope that exists a lot in narratives where a character gets outed without their consent, gets outed in dramatic ways in front of people. Very often we have this also with trans characters that get revealed as trans in what's called a naked reveal, which is just incredibly disrespectful. It denies characters their agency. And frankly, it's also incredibly traumatic to a lot of queer people who had to deal with these situations. And so forced outings are things that should definitely come with a content warning, because a lot of queer folks have that experience and are not willing to or ready to relive that experience. And it's also, again, something that shouldn't be a plot gimmick. It's something that you want to approach with a lot of nuance. Which also brings me to queerness as a content warning. And yes, I think we've all seen these reviews that are like, oh, I wish the author had told us that there was a gay character in this young adult book, or that this was about lesbians, or that queer people exist. That's not a content warning. Okay. I actually teach a class on content warnings and how to write them. Content warnings are warranted when there is content that might traumatize or re-traumatize people. Queer people's existence is just fact. It is not a content warning. But saying like, oh, this book has explicit cis male penetrative sex, like that's a content warning. That tells an audience who might not want to read about this, oh hey, like skip that, or hey, this is coming in this book, or this book contains the death of a queer person. That is a content warning, because again, like that tells us to expect this type of content and be able to put our own trauma responses into place, or put a boundary in place that says, you know what, I'm currently not in a space where I can read or deal with this situation. So please don't ever go like, oh, by the way, content warning, this includes queer people. No, that's not how you do these. All right, let's talk about some of the do's, because there's just so many don'ts. And often, yes, it is easier to say what shouldn't be done than what should be done. But let me give you some do's to try out and do more of, please. All right. The first thing is intersectionality, which means all of these things that I talked about, tropes are tropes because they are ultimately reductive. They reduce a person to just one thing. And none of us are just one thing. Again, I use a lot of GIFs from Pose, which I highly, highly recommend you check out on Netflix. Again, content warnings definitely for AIDS, for homophobia and transphobia, for colorism and racism. But this show is so good because it shows so many of these intersections. Pray Tell, the character in this GIF here specifically, does embody so many intersections. Like he is a um, cis gay male. He is a person of color. He loves fashion. He is very emotional. He MCs for the ballroom scene. He deals with losing lovers to AIDS. He has so many intersections. Like he's very much a father figure, but also someone who embodies a lot of queer activism in the 80s and 90s. Give a character like that kind of rich, complex background to really make them intersectional. Have a queer person who is also like being a white, able bodied gay man is very different from being a mixed race person of color who is bisexual and also is a wheelchair user. Like there's just so many different identities that all of us have that not playing with that honestly just doesn't do your characters any favor. So make them complex. Normalizing inclusive language, which means things like defaulting to they them pronouns, having characters share their pronouns, things like that, including some of the labels that I mentioned earlier on the page. It just makes your writing feel so much more welcoming to such a wider audience. And yes, this means also researching some of these things. What are some terms that are outdated? What is the current language to describe certain people? What is language that you should avoid? What is language that's maybe not yours to use? There's a lot of research you can and should do about that. But the more we have of this, the less queerbaiting, as I mentioned earlier, becomes a factor because now we have, like, instead of just subtext or interpretations, we have actual queer text. And that's what needs to happen more of. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but queer friends, like, again, and I'm not just speaking for myself, but I actually have much, much more queer friends, many, many more queer friends than straight friends. Like, we don't just run as like single entities. Found families are so important to queer folks, especially because sometimes there are tensions with family. Sometimes family is estranged. Sometimes they live far away from family. There are a lot of reasons that found family, and especially found queer family, becomes very much a supporting system for queer characters as it does for queer people. So use this. This again also gives you so much nuance to include and so much more material to avoid tokenization and to avoid harmful stereotypes. So use that and look at some found family situations. Look at your queer friends, and use that in your writing. Also, queerness doesn't have any particular reason in your plot. Like, I sometimes hear this as a question where it's like, well, but shouldn't the fact that I'm including a queer person, shouldn't it have some sort of plot reason? Or there needs to be some sort of reason why this person is queer. By the way, if you need another good queer rec, the new Shira on Netflix, it's complete. Noelle Stevenson is in this GIF. It's just beautiful. And it's hella queer. And no, there is no reason, there's no queer pain or homophobia in the show. They're just queer people. Shira, Schitt's Creek, like they're two that are like just really close to my heart because they present queerness just for the sake of queerness. That doesn't need to be a reason, just as that is doesn't need to be a reason for a character's straightness. So embrace that. Also, keep in mind that not all queerness is about sex and romance. I mentioned quite a few labels earlier that deal with romantic interaction, but often queer narratives kind of get reduced to, oh, it's about like, it matters for queer romance or for like finding a partner, or it is intrinsically of a sexual nature, when that's not what queerness is all about. It's really so much more than that. It's so many intersections. Just have a queer person exist. They don't have to be like embroiled in finding their life partner or dealing with family conflict because of their sexuality. Like, it's more than that. So don't just reduce it to this. All right. As I mentioned, I want to leave you all with some recommendations of queer books and TV by queer creators, because honestly, that is such a powerful place to start out, especially if you are writing outside of your own lane. I highly recommend doing some searches for own voices queer books, whether that's on Goodreads or Amazon or anywhere you find out more about books. Same for TV. I'm going to give you some starters here. I'm going to add some to this because it's been a hot minute since I've updated the actual list. And I'm going to mention the streaming services or where you can access this as well. But one of the things I would really encourage you to do is make sure that queer creators were involved in whatever content you're consuming. There are shows that have queer and trans representation, but don't actually include trans characters or queer characters. And that's like a whole nother issue. If you've seen The Danish Girl with Eddie Redmayne, where Eddie Redmayne, who is a cis male actor, portrays one of history's most famous trans women, like, that's a problem because it precludes actual trans people from having these roles. Or the show Transparent on Amazon, which got a lot of awards and a lot of media buzz, but again, had so many people that were not trans actors, and also employed actors that turned out to be predators and turned out to be incredibly problematic. So instead, they could have just cast and relied on more heavily on queer creators. So in terms of young adult books, some that I highly, highly recommend. I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver. Mason is a non-binary author, and they actually were the first non-binary author with a non-binary book published by a big 5 publisher. So definitely check out their work. Also, something that's not on this list is Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, which is a Dia de los Muertos story. It's a ghost story. It's a trans story. It deals with characters who identify as Latino. I would highly, highly recommend that. Dreadnought by April Daniels is very much a trans superhero story. However, it also deals with a lot of transphobia in the first book. So just, again, content warning for Dreadnought. I love it. April Daniels herself is a trans person. It's so well done. It definitely also hits a lot of intense, sensitive content. Adam Silvera, in general, is a very well-known gay YA writer. His debut was More Happy Than Not. He has a great diverse backlist of mostly contemporary or sci-fi young adult that I would absolutely recommend to anyone. C.B. Lee is an Asian American writer. Her series, Not Your Sidekick, again, has so many diverse characters and diverse genders and ability levels represented. And We Are the Ants by Sean David Hutchinson, who is a cis gay writer, deals a lot with mental health in a way that is related to some subsets of queer pain, but he does elevate it beyond that, where it's like about more than that. So definitely check out his work in more realistic and contemporary young adult. There's so much queer YA coming out each year. I'm like looking at my bookshelf right now, and I honestly have the rare, like, I feel like most of my bookshelf is made of queer books. So if you do need any recommendations for something specific, reach out to me on Twitter at AlexHarrowSFF. I love talking about these things. So let me recommend you books. Some adult books that I absolutely adore and love and recommend are Criminal Intentions by Cole McCade. Cole McCade stuff in general is mostly romance. Criminal Intentions actually is a male romance, but also crime investigation series that's written as if they were episodes in a TV show. So the first series is 13 books. He's currently working on the second series, but there's so many intersectionally queer characters. Like one of the main characters is a Persian American gay Jew or bisexual, really, Jew. The other character is a neurotypical and gray sexual Korean American gay man. So pick out books that have a lot of different nuances. Like in Cole McCade stuff, most people that get screen time are very, very gay. Same for Roanna Silver's Chameleon Moon. Their books in general are just so hopeful. So if you're looking for something to uplift, this is about a city that slowly is being consumed by fire, but it's also incredibly hopeful and incredibly intersectional in the way that they portray characters of different ability levels, different backgrounds, different species, sexualities, genders. Highly, highly recommend. One of my favorite books that I read back in 2017, I think it's 2019 actually, was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. They are a non-binary writer, and their whole premise for this book is, what if the first son of the US, what if we had a president who had biracial kids, and one of the president's sons, her son, falls in love with one of the princes of England after having kind of a fiasco, fake friendship, hate relationship. It's very enemies to friends to lovers, fake relationship, but also political intrigue, ADHD rap. Like, it's fantastic. And my friend Anna Szabo writes the Twisted Wishes series that has different queer representations throughout their books, but all of their books in general are just very delightful. Most of them are contemporary romance, and I would highly recommend you check their work out. In terms of movies and TV, I already mentioned Disclosure. Highly, highly recommend that, as well as Pose, which has also been made by so many trans people of color. Tales of the City, Special. Special is actually done and co-directed by a gay white male who also deals with cerebral palsy. The Fosters, which initially aired on Freeform, but it's now on Netflix, and Sense8. Sense8 specifically has so many cool intersections in terms of gender and backgrounds and cultures that I would highly recommend that. Yeah, anyway, if you have any questions and need recommendations or have questions about any of the tropes I talked to you about, please either ask me during the conference or reach out to me via email at alex@alexharrow.com. Find me on the web at alexharrow.com or social media at alexharrowsff. I would love to talk to you. And yeah, this is stuff that I could literally talk about for days. So hitting my 45-minute mark here, but feel free to ask me anything, anything that you need clarification about, and have a great rest of your conference.